Shavua Tov, and we're going to continue first with our introduction to Menachos, and then in Mitzvah Hashem, we go on to learn a little bit of Masechta Yom. That's how we divide up our time, as you know. So with regard to our introduction and our overview of Masechta Menachos, we're going to speak now about a mincha called Mafe Tanur. So this mincha is baked in an oven, and there's no separation between the dough and the floor of the oven. There's no kli hamafsik. That's called a minchas Mafe Tanur. And then we have another kind of a mincha, which is called a minchas Mafe Tanur shel Rekikim. And if you remember what we discussed, is that was a case where the way we do the afiyah is keminchas chalos hadar. Excuse me, I forgot to take care of one thing technically here on Zoom.
It's really funny. It looks like.
Okay, then. So we did that. Okay. Thanks. Okay. So just to try to get back to where we were. Suras afiyosi keminchas chalos chodov vein chalutim en elavi ofen nesinas hashemen bilvad v'yesh rishot me'achronim kosu shemelvad achiluk zeh heim chalukim gam b'tzurosam shem avos urekikim dakin. So there's a minchas mafe that has one surah, and it looks like a loaf of bread, and then there's another mincha which is called rekikim, and that has a different surah. It looks like very thick rekikim. Okay. Now, our subject for today is going to be the following. We know that we have, in the case of an individual who offers and takes it upon himself voluntarily to bring a korban mincha, we have 4 different possible scenarios or categories of a korban mincha. We have machvas, marcheshes, which are menachos that are placed into a pan that separates it from the oven. And we had chalos and rekikim, which are baked directly in the oven. In each case, we need what's called an isaron. Again, we haven't gotten into the specifics about what that volume is, but a certain minimum volume. And according to the Shita Rabbi Yehuda, this isaron, which is the remainder after what's called kmitza, we'll see what kmitza means, but that balance of the mincha is baked into 10 different chalos. Reb Meir has 12 different chalos. Fine. Our subject today is what happens in a voluntary korban mincha when the misnadev, the one who takes it upon himself, changes the law. So, for example, ha'omer harei alai minchas machvas, he takes it upon himself to bring a mincha of machvas, and instead, hevi marcheshes, or the opposite. He takes it upon himself, harei alai marcheshes, vehevi machvas. What's the law in this case? Do we bring the mincha as a nidava, because this is not the mincha that he took upon himself, and therefore he's going to have to replace this mincha with a second mincha. And it turns out that he has brought two minchas. One mincha that he accepted upon himself, which he's going to now have to replace. Let's say he took upon himself to bring a machmas, he's got to bring a machmas. And he brought a marcheshes, we'll take the minchas marcheshes as a korban nidava. We'll give another example. Let's say he declares al soles harei zula machvas. He looks at the solas. It's not a case of the gavra taking upon himself a neder, an obligation to bring machvas as opposed to marcheshes or vice versa. But he actually points his finger at the solas and he says harei zula machvas. But he brings it as a korban mincha marcheshes. Or he says harei zula marcheshes and he brings it as a korban mincha of a machmas. In that case, it's not that, as we said earlier, he ends up with two menachos. The first one which he brought and the other one which he has to bring to replace and fulfill his neder. But in this case, the mincha is completely psula. You cannot take a mincha that was sanctified as a marcheshes and bring it as a machmas, or vice versa. These are two fundamentally different categories of a korban mincha. And again, as we go along, in Ritz Hashem, and get our feet a little bit more wet in menachos, we'll begin to appreciate the differences between a machmas and a marcheshes. And what we said before is that a marcheshes is not just an open frying pan, but it's a closed pot. So it's got a covering to it. Machmas is completely open. That's the sheet of Rabbi Yosef Glili. That bears repetition. We also mentioned Rav Chanina, who says that a marcheshes has a deeper kli, and therefore it's a softer batter, whereas a machmas is flat. It's not. It has no depth to it, and therefore you end up with a kind of a dough that's very hard, that's tough. In any event, we have a difference between machmas and marcheshes, and they're two fundamentally different categories of menachos. And he designated a soles for this, and he turns out to bring it for that. It's absolutely psula. Once he's already pointed to a klishoris and declared that it's hegdish, l'shem mincha achas, whether it be machvas or marcheshes, shuvi efshol l'shanoso l'mincha acheres, he can't change it to another mincha. Here's another example of the distinction between harei alai and harei zu. Here he makes a different kind of a change. Harei alai mincha shel shnei esronim. He offers to bring not one isaron, which is the minimum amount that everyone has to bring, but twice that amount, 2 isaron. And he wants to bring it as one indivisible mincha. That means in one kli. At the end, what he did was he brought it in 2 kelim, 1 isaron in each kli. In such a case, the mincha that he brought, or maybe even 2 minchas, because he brought in 2 kelim, is kosher. He has not fulfilled his obligation to bring 2 esronim in 1 kli, but at the end of the day, when he fulfills his obligation, he'll end up with 2 menachos. However, and here we move on to page 2, if he has in front of him 2 esronim of solas, and he says, Harei elu, these 2 esronim, lemincha b'kli and he brings them in two different kelim. That's a mincha psula. And again, the same logic applies over here. He was magdishit as one kind of mincha, a mincha of two esronim in one kli, and he brought it as two different minachos, each one has only one isar. He's absolutely changed the nature of the HaKadosh. If it was only a matter of fulfilling his personal obligation, we'll accept this double mincha and two kelim as an adava, and then he'll bring a replacement, an additional adava. But if he's magdish this as one mincha with two esronim, then bringing two esronim in, meaning one isar in each of two kelim, is not the mincha that he was magdish. And once the inherent kedusha, which means the designation of this soles, is for X, it cannot be brought for Y, and the carbon is cost. Now we have.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, please.
But why cannot you just combine the two kelim into one, and then instead of having two offerings and two kelim, you'll just have the required amount in one
You're
kelim?
absolutely right. That's what they should have done, because he wanted to bring both esronim in one kli. Had they fulfilled his desire the way he was magdashit, then everything would be fine. But as a matter of fact, that's not the way they were makriv the carbon. They were makriv it as two different menachos and two different kelim with one isar in each kli. He's not gaining anything or losing anything financially because he obligated himself in two esronim. But the question is, did he fulfill his neder by bringing two menachos, each of which had an isaron in two different kelim? And the answer is he absolutely did not fulfill his neder. And that is the shita that we've been dealing with until now. And if I remember correctly, we don't have a name to that shita, do we? Do we have a name? An anonymous shita. But now we have, so the anonymous shita, we call it the Tanakama, the Rabbana. And now we have a dissenting view of Rabbi Shimon. Now we have a name. And Rabbi Shimon says that we don't care about the kelim. There's no din of kviyas hakli. And therefore, whether or not he says harei alai or he says harei zu, in all cases, the mincha is a mincha kshera and yotzi yidei nidra. And he fulfills his obligation of a nid. So whereas the Chachamim, the Tanakama hold that everything depends upon the kviyas of the kelim, and if you brought these two esronim and two kelim, that sets it up as two different menachos. Reb Shimon is willing to say, I don't care about how many kelim. It's all part of one mincha. And the status of the mincha is going to be determined by the neder and the akdosha. When he said, Arei alai lavi shnei esronim, the two kelim are both integrated into one mincha, because that's what he said. He said, I want to obligate myself to bring one mincha with two esronim. The fact that they're in two different kelim, says Reb Shimon, is irrelevant. And even if he looks at the solas, and he's magdish the solas to be brought as two esronim in one mincha, and they brought it in two different kelim with one isron in each, it doesn't matter. Because the akdosha of the solas includes within it the possibility of bringing the menachos in two different kelim. And then he writes, this is all a sugya Masechta Menachos, but it's good to get our feet wet, because I have a tremendous fear of learning Menachos. So I want to have an introduction. Af l'shitas chachamim, kviyas hakeli chala rak b'shas haneder, kigon she'omer arei alai lahavi et zu b'machos, aval in nodar stam mincha, v'b'shas hafrosha, Yiched es hasoles l'shem mincha mesuyemes lechovas nidro ein b'dvar of klum v'yochol l'chanosa lemincha cheres. According to Chachamim, there is a halacha of kviyas kli, but that kviyas kli is set in stone v'shas haneder, at the moment that he took the neder. In other words, if he declared Harei zu or Harei alat lahavi zu b'machas, so he mentions the kli, whether it be a machas or cheshes, is irrelevant. But when he formulates his neder, he explicitly enunciates in a kli of this category. Then he's indicating in his very neder that he wants the kli to be an essential part of his mincha, and therefore it's koveya, the kli is koveya. But if on the other hand, he just took a neder stop, he said, I take upon myself to bring 2 esron, a mincha of 2 esron. In such a case, that's called neder nadar b'mincha stam. And now later on, he decides that, let me bring an isaron in this kli, I'll bring another isaron in another kli. That's not b'shas hakdasha, but rather b'shas hafrosha. It wasn't at the moment that he took his neder in the second case that he designated and separated one kli from the other. When he took his neder, he took a neder stam. And when he was mafresh in neder, he said, I'm going to be mafresh in this way. And he was mafresh it l'shem mincha mesuyemes. That's irrelevant. The hafrosha, what he says at the time of his hafrosha, that declaration is not a determining critical fact. It's only at the moment that he took the neder that adding the kli into the equation and saying, I want to bring 2 esronim, and that's my neder. In one kli, that's when the kli is token. Now, what happens, again, in another situation where, as I indicated before, he wants to alter the Torah law. The Torah law is bring a mincha from chita. And there may be very few exceptions to that rule. Like, for example, minchas ha'omer that we bring from siorin or minchas soto. But 99% of the menachos have to be brought from chitin. And he says, Harei olai havi mincha min hasiorim. Or another example where he changes the nature of the law. Amar harei olai mincha min hakemach. Instead of bringing a mincha from solid, which is refined flour, he says, I'm gonna accept and commit myself to bring a mincha min hakemach. I guess kemach is what you would call today whole bran or whole wheat, as opposed to white flour that's refined. So here we have a machlokas as to whether or not we could cut him off in the middle of his sentence. Achamim say Yavi Minchas Soles Chita. Even though he said Kemach, even though he said Siorim, he's going to bring Soles Chita. And what we're going to do is we're going to cut him off mid-sentence. We're going to listen to the beginning of his sentence, Harei olai mincha, and we're going to close our ears, and we're not going to listen to the end when he says Mina Siorim, or when he says Mina Kemach. And Reb Shimon says, Lo chal nidra. Why? Because Reb Shimon says you can't stop a person in the middle of a sentence. You've got to take the entire declaration as one entity. And there is no such thing as a mincha that comes min hasiorim or a mincha that comes from kemach. It's got to be min hachitin, it's got to be min hasoles. And if he decides to invent a figment of his imagination, a category of mincha that the Torah doesn't recognize, that's a meaningless neder. It's like a person who took a neder that I will fly to Pluto, and it's not chal. Now this machlokas revolves around the following issue: Tfos Lashon Rishon or Gam B'Gmar Dvarav Adam Nitmas. Tfos Lashon Rishon means we can split his declaration and grab the beginning of what he said. We'll fill in the missing blanks. We're going to change the way he verbalized his acceptance. And instead of hearing Harei Olai Lavi Karban Mincha Min Hasiorin, he said a Karban Mincha, that's got to be Min Achitim. It's almost as if we're saying he made a mistake and it was a slip of the tongue. That's called Tfos Lashon Rishon. And Tfos Lashon Rishon is predicated on the following principle: Ein Adam Motzi Dvar B'Tel Mipiv. We don't think that people are stupid and they just say things that are meaningless. There are people who are like they fit that category. They'll say things that are absolutely meaningless, frivolities. But we believe that Chazaka, the assumption is Ein Adam Motzi Dvar. He wanted to carve a mincha. All right, he made a mistake and he called it a mincha min hasaorim, which doesn't exist. Tfos Lashon Rishon. We know he wants to bring a mincha. He made such a commitment, and we'll accept it, and we'll bring a karban mincha min achita or min asol. Rabbi Shimon, on the other hand, says af b'gmar dvarav adam nitvos, which means that when a person makes a declaration, there's one indivisible declaration. It's a sentence that has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And we have to look at his declaration and his verbal commitment as one entity. And either it exists in the world of Allah or it doesn't exist. If it doesn't exist, then his statement and his Kabbalah, his Ischayvus, is meaningless. That's Rabbi Shimon. The Motzi Dvara B'Telem. That's irrelevant. Why? Because what generates the status of Hegdish in Karbanos is what he actually said. And he said both the beginning of the sentence and the end of the sentence. And he wants to generate a Kedushas Mincha Min Hasiorin. There ain't no such thing. And therefore his declaration cannot effectuate any sort of Ischayvus. It cannot be chalas any sort of an eder. It's completely batel umevuta. It's dvarim b'telu. Now we have a similar machlokas between the Chacham and Rav Shimon in a different scenario. The man declared, "Harei alai mincha below shemen ulevona." You remember that a mincha is not just made of soles and loaves of bread, but it's also consists of an addition of shemen and levona. The man says, I'm going to bring a karban mincha. I swear to God, I'm going to bring a karban mincha without levona, without shemen. Or the man says, Harei alai chatzi isaron. We said the minimum, the barest minimum of a volume of solace for a mincha is always got to be an isaron. He says, I'm going to bring a chatzi isaron, half an isaron. According to the Chachamim, his neder is chal. He's got to bring an isaron together with shemen and levona. According to Rabbi Shimon, he's potter below klum. He doesn't bring anything. So it's nadev kiderech hamisnadvu. His nedava is not a nedava which is recognized by the Torah. Now, as far as the Chachamim are concerned, so we have the Shita of Beit Shammai. Beit Shammai says, Ein Adam Motzi Dvarav Levatola. A person doesn't speak meaningless words. If he took upon himself a commitment, we have to restructure it for him. We have to refurbish it for him. He might not have done it the right way, but he definitely wants to accept this, his chayvus to bring, in this case, a karban dove. And therefore, Beit Shammai says, Tzarech lahavi mincha ki hilchas. He has to bring the mincha the way the Torah demands him to bring a mincha. And therefore, if he says Harei alai mincha, he means a mincha of chitim. He means a mincha of solace. He said ben asa'orim. Comes along Beit Shammai and they say, you know what? he now decided that he doesn't want to bring a mincha at all. He wants to back out from his original commitment. And that's called bitul. He wants to be mavatel his commitment. We have a rule in Hegdesh, says Beit Shammai, ein adam choser bo mihegdesh. Normally, when a person makes a commitment, we give him a little bit of rope. That's called Kadesha Elos Talmud L'Rav. We give him a few seconds, and we'll see, maybe he'll change his mind. And he has the right to do so. But in Hegdesh, says Beit Shammai, the very moment he made the declaration, it's already chal. It exists in the universe. A person looks at a cow and he says, Arezu Ola, it automatically becomes a carbon Ola. We're not going to give him that flat and allow him to be choser bo. So if he has Minasa Orim, we're going to interpret that as if he wants to be choser bo. He wants to rescind and cancel his original commitment. He does not have the power to do so. Beis Hillel, on the other hand, disagree with Beit Shammai. They maintain that a neder is chal only in the way he said it. He doesn't realize that a mincha has to be minachita. In his mind, he's ignorant. Most of us are ignorant about menachos. That a mincha has to be menachit, and he doesn't know that. He thinks, carte blanche. The Torah gives me the right to bring a mincha minasa orim. I eat Wheaties and it's minasa orim. Why can't I bring a mincha minasa orim? Therefore, says Beit Hillel, if he would have known that his Kabbalah, his commitment and neder is invalid, there ain't no such thing as a mincha minasa, he wouldn't have gone into this commitment at all. And that's called Hegdesh B'Tov. The entire enterprise of committing himself to this entity of Hegdesh, meaning mincha minasa, is a non-starter. It is completely tos. It's predicated on a mistaken assumption. And we cannot validate a commitment, a neder, that was taken based on a mistake, an invalid confusion. And therefore, Beis Hillel say that we have to throw it all out. And it would seem that the machlokas between the Chacham and Reb Shimon is the identical machlokas between Beit Shammai and Beis Hillel. And whereas the Chachamim will validate his commitment, that's because Tfos Lashon Rishon, they accept Beit Shammai. Anything that he adds at the end of his Lashon Rishon is just a Chazorah, and he doesn't have the power to be Choser. On the other hand, Reb Shimon, who validates his neder. On the other hand, Reb Shimon, who torpedoes and invalidates his neder. Eino chayav below klu. Reb Shimon is not willing to accept the Lashon Rishon and then say, well, he's being Choser bo. But rather going with the line of thinking of Beis Hillel, he says the man is making a mistake. And if he would have known, if somebody would have taught him properly, that there ain't no such thing as a korban mincha min ha-siorim, he never would have committed himself. The man is hung up on siorim. He wants to bring a korban mincha min ha-siorim. So this is where we're going to stop in our introduction to the Menachos. Ha'omer nadarti isronim lemincha. These are going to be cases where a man took upon himself a neder, but he doesn't remember the specifics of the neder. How does halacha guide us in a case where he doesn't remember?